Viktor Frankl first began writing seriously about what he would later call the existential vacuum in the 1940s and 1950s, using clinical observations gathered over decades of psychiatric practice. By the time he published The Will to Meaning in 1969, he was prepared to make a claim that, at the time, most of his psychiatric colleagues found either overstated or simply eccentric, that a significant proportion of the psychological problems presenting in Western clinical settings, including depression, aggression, and addiction, were not primarily the result of biological dysfunction or unresolved childhood conflict, but of what he called neugenic neurosis rooted in the existential dimension of human existence, in the specifically human need for meaning that was going unmet in the lives of a growing number of people. Of these three mass pathologies, depression, aggression, and addiction was perhaps the one he found most philosophically revealing. Depression and aggression, while they could certainly have existential roots, were also straightforwardly familiar from the biological and psychodynamic perspectives that dominated psychiatry in his era. But addiction, particularly the dramatic rise in drug and alcohol use that Frankl observed in Western societies during the post-war decades, seemed to him to point with unusual clarity toward the existential dimension. The addict is not, after all, simply seeking relief from pain. If they were, there would be simpler and more effective ways to achieve that. The addict is seeking something more specific and more interesting, a particular quality of experience that ordinary life, as they are living it, does not provide. Understanding what that quality is, and why they cannot find it elsewhere, is the key to understanding addiction from a logotherapeutic perspective. Frankl identified what the addict is seeking as something very close to what all human beings seek, a sense of aliveness, of full engagement with existence, of being, even briefly, entirely present rather than merely going through the motions of a life that has lost its depth and urgency. He used the German word Lebensfreude, the joy of living, to describe this quality, and he observed that its presence or absence was one of the most reliable indicators of a person's existential health. A person who has found genuine meaning in their life, who has something to live for, someone to love, something to create or contribute, tends to have Lebensfreude as a natural feature of their experience. They feel the aliveness of their own existence as a good, not merely as a neutral biological fact. For such a person, ordinary life is, at least intermittently, genuinely satisfying. They do not need to alter their state of consciousness to feel that they are really here. But a person in the grip of the existential vacuum, who has lost, or never found, the sense that their life means something, experiences ordinary existence very differently. For them, the ordinary is flat, muted, stripped of the quality that makes it feel worth the bother. They may function perfectly well by external criteria, hold a job, maintain relationships, discharge their social obligations, but inside, the experience of being alive has a kind of grayness, a lack of urgency and depth that they find difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Frankl described this inner state as one of the defining features of the existential vacuum. Not simply unhappiness, not simply anxiety, but a specific form of emptiness that feels like the absence of something that should be there and isn't. It is this emptiness that creates the vulnerability to addiction. What alcohol and drugs, and, by extension, any form of compulsive behavior that works by altering mood or consciousness, offer is precisely the quality that the existential vacuum has removed: aliveness, presence, intensity, the sense that something is actually happening rather than merely passing through. The first drink or the first hit does not merely reduce pain or anxiety. It produces, for a time, exactly the feeling of full engagement with existence that the existential life provides naturally. This is why the experience can feel, to someone in the grip of the existential vacuum, like a revelation rather than merely a pleasure, like a glimpse of what life could feel like if it actually meant something. Frankl understood that this is precisely what makes addiction so powerful and so resistant to purely behavioral approaches. The addict is not simply pleasure-seeking in a shallow sense. They are, at some level, doing something that makes existential sense given their situation. They have found a way to produce, however temporarily and however destructively, the quality of experience that their circumstances of meaning starvation are not providing. To tell such a person simply to stop, to invoke willpower, to point to the consequences, to describe the damage the substance is doing to their body and relationships, is to address the surface while leaving the depths untouched. The behavior will stop for a time, perhaps, if the person has enough motivation and support. But without a genuine alternative, without the existential nourishment that the substance was substituting for, the pullback toward the substance will remain, and in most cases it will prove stronger than the willpower marshaled against it. This is not a comfortable analysis, and Frankl did not offer it as a comfortable one. He was aware that existential vacuums are not easily filled, that finding genuine meaning is hard work that cannot be accomplished by a few sessions of therapy or a new set of behavioral strategies. But he insisted that the hardness of the work does not diminish its necessity. And he pointed to clinical evidence, his own case histories, and the developing literature on meaning-centered approaches to treatment, that when the existential dimension is directly addressed, outcomes improve dramatically compared to approaches that focus only on the behavior itself or on its psychological and biological substrates. Frankl also explored the social and cultural dimensions of addiction in ways that are strikingly contemporary. He noted that the rise of mass addiction in Western societies coincided with, and was not coincidentally related to, the erosion of the traditional frameworks of meaning that had previously given people a sense of purpose and place: religion, stable community, occupational identity, clear moral codes, multi-generational family structures. As these frameworks dissolved under the pressures of industrialization, urbanization, and cultural modernization, large numbers of people found themselves in precisely the existential situation that Frankl identified as addiction vulnerable, free in the sense of being released from traditional constraints, but adrift in the sense of lacking the inner orientation that genuine freedom requires. Into this vacuum, this freedom without direction, came the mass marketing of pleasure, the ready availability of substances, and the cultural normalization of escape as a response to difficulty. Frankl was careful to distinguish between genuine freedom, the kind that comes with the discovery of one's own specific meaning and the courage to live in accordance with it, and what he called permissiveness, the removal of external constraints without the development of inner ones. A person who has found genuine meaning is free in the deepest sense, because they have something to be free for. They use their freedom in the service of their values and commitments. But a person who has only permissiveness, who has been told that they can do anything, that there are no binding norms, that self-expression is the highest good, but who has not done the inner work of discovering what is specifically theirs to express, is not actually more free. They are more vulnerable to being defined by their appetites, by whatever is most immediately stimulating, by the nearest available substitute for the meaning they have not found. This analysis has specific implications for what Frankl thought effective addiction treatment must involve. He was supportive of all approaches that addressed the biological dimension of addiction, acknowledging that physical dependency is real and requires medical management. He was also supportive of psychological approaches that address trauma, family dynamics, and the behavioral patterns that sustain addictive behavior. But he insisted that these were necessary but not sufficient. What was also necessary, and what was frequently absent from treatment approaches that ignored the existential dimension, was what he called logotherapeutic confrontation, a direct engagement with the question of what the patient's life is for. What do they love? What do they feel responsible for? What can only they contribute? What would they be doing with their time and energy if the substance were not consuming it? These questions are not rhetorical. They are diagnostic. And in Frankl's experience, they frequently revealed something important, that the patient already had, or had once had, the beginnings of an answer, a person they loved, a skill they valued, a commitment they had made, that had been buried under the escalating demands of the addiction. The therapeutic task was not to implant meaning from the outside, but to uncover and reconnect the patient with the meaning that was already potentially theirs, to help them see that the existential vacuum was not their natural condition but a state that had developed in specific circumstances and that could, with work, be inhabited differently. Frankl also addressed the specific form of addiction that he called fanaticism, the addiction to ideology, to movements, to charismatic leaders or causes that promise to fill the existential vacuum with ready-made purpose. He saw this as perhaps the most dangerous form of meaning substitute, because it presents itself as the opposite of an escape, as a form of engagement, commitment, and belonging. But the commitment is pseudo-commitment. It does not arise from the person's genuine inner life but from the relief of having the question of meaning answered for them by an external authority. And when the ideology or the movement demands, as they always eventually do, that the person do something that their own conscience would reject, the person who has surrendered their existential independence to the group has no inner resources from which to refuse. This is how otherwise decent people come to participate in terrible things, not through wickedness but through the abdication of individual meaning in favor of the group's demands. The implications of Frankl's analysis extend well beyond the clinical setting. They speak to any context in which human beings reach for something external to fill an inner emptiness. The overworker who has made achievement a substitute for meaning, the person who fills every silence with their phone, the one who maintains constant social stimulation to avoid confronting the question of what their life is actually for. These are not clinical addictions in the diagnostic sense. But they are, in Frankl's understanding, versions of the same dynamic. the substitution of an external source of stimulation or belonging or identity for the harder and more durable achievement of genuine meaning. And in each case, the substitute does not satisfy, can never satisfy, because it is addressing the symptom rather than the cause. The existential vacuum remains, beneath whatever is being used to fill it, and its claims on the person do not diminish with the passage of time. Frankl's message to the addict, and to everyone who, in their own way, is addicted to something that substitutes for meaning, is not a comfortable one, but it is a hopeful one. The hope is not that the problem is simple. The hope is that the problem points in a specific direction, toward the genuine question of what one's life is for, a question that has a genuine answer, available to every human being, no matter how thoroughly the previous search for that answer has been derailed. The existential vacuum is not a permanent condition. It is a situation. And situations can be changed, not always easily, not always quickly, not always with the help of conventional medicine or psychology alone, but genuinely, durably, with the kind of change that does not require the ongoing management of a substitute but rather the discovery of what was needed all along.